All right. So, welcome back to the Midlife Momentum podcast. I have a guest with me today. Her name is Niki Woods, and she's an international midlife well-being and menopause consultant and working directly with businesses and a personal coach who specializes in working with women in midlife. As a member of the British Menopause Society and International Menopause Society, Niki takes an integrative approach to improving women's health, fitness, mindset, and habits in midlife, which of course includes supporting them to understand and manage their menopause transition. Niki also believes supporting men to be part of the menopause conversation because it benefits everyone and it's a vital component of better interpersonal relationships, both at home and at work. She also hosts a men only free Facebook community called The Man's Guide to Menopause. And she also has a published book of the same name, which we're going to discuss. As she's dedicated to providing a safe space for men to learn, ask questions, and receive peer support. So thank you, Niki, for being here today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I just want to get right into it because I think this is such a great initiative that you took to write this book, The Man's Guide to Menopause. So tell us a little bit about what you do and why you wrote this book.
So obviously you covered quite a lot of it before. I deal directly with women, and where I speak with them, coaching them with their fitness, their fat loss, their body goals, their mindset, their habits, and of course their perimenopause, menopause, wherever they are on that journey. And then I work directly with businesses. So I speak at conferences, I'm on panels covering things like menopause, well-being, speaking about issues about gender, retention, etc., training on menopause, so manager training on menopause, etc., from both awareness for employees and formal training for managers. And so obviously I'm speaking to men and women both inside the workplace and outside. And almost every time I have a conversation with a man, there would always be the feedback of, I wish I'd understood more about this when my wife or partner was going through it, or the men in manager training would be, oh, I didn't really want to come to this, and now I'm so glad I did, and I've learned so much, and I'm going to go home and talk to my wife. And I just kind of got to this point where I was like, someone needs to be talking directly to men about this, because all the men who really want to help, and you'll know this from your own work, everything really about menopause is directly written to us as women who are going through it. And so a man who would like go on Google and try and look things up, although he can find some information, it's not written aimed at him. And sometimes they kind of end up feeling like they're like going into an area they're not meant to be in, or they're looking over our shoulders or something. And also I felt like some of the stuff that needed to be explained in a slightly different way for men than for women. And so yeah, basically that's why I decided to take it upon myself to write The Man's Guide to Menopause.
I love that you did that. I love that you saw a need. Obviously, you saw something that was there that was surprising, that men were actually coming away and were actually very interested. And then you took it upon yourself to write this book, which I think is fantastic and very unique. I don't know if there's another one out there, but I think it's a really valuable thing that you've done. And so you mentioned that how men learn about menopause, or what they're asking about menopause, is a little bit different than women, and how you would speak to them is a little bit different. So what is different about your book, because you are speaking to men as opposed to the books that are geared to women?
I think one of the things is, well, not all men would want to read a book on it, quite clearly. Some people will just want tiny bits, but I think a lot of men really want to get kind of under the hood of really understanding everything about the topic. I don't know if you ever had these books called the Haynes Manual. We used to have in Britain these books that were called Haynes Manual, and you had one for every car. And you could literally go in and the men would like read these books. My dad always had one for every car, and he could go in, he could read everything about the car, how to take it apart, and all of that sort of thing. And I felt like the people who the men who my book would appeal to and I wrote are those sorts of men that they don't just want to understand a little bit. They want to understand the explanation behind everything, the why behind everything. And so that's what I set out to write. So I explain like what menopause is, the causes, the signs, the symptoms, the diagnosis, the potential treatments, not just HRT, but all about lifestyle, etc. Because I felt like that's the sort of men who would want to understand. That's the way they would want to know things. They can dip in, they can read it in any order, or they could read it to cover. But on top of that, I felt like they needed to understand about how to communicate the knowledge, how this might impact intimacy. And I wrote specific chapters in that book that I'm not sure that you would find in a woman's book. For example, like I said, the sex, intimacy, and libido, kind of trying to explain to a man some of the things that either the partner might not really understand herself or might not feel comfortable to explain about how that can very specifically be impacted potentially for some of us. And then also giving them some tools of how to talk about these things and how to be supportive, because I felt like sometimes it's easier for a partner to hear it from someone else other than their partner. And that gives them certain tools in a more dispassionate way to then come into the conversations. So I really kind of wrote it as a toolkit for those sorts of men to help them in their interactions at work, but mainly at home.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you said is so key too, though. These are topics that a lot of times women aren't willing to even talk about with their partners, so that they're completely in the dark a lot of the time, our partners, about what's going on with us because we don't necessarily even want to talk about it. And then it ends up impacting the relationship and the sexual intimacy and everything. So I think it's so key that you've written that, and that, like you said, I just like the term that you you have them look under the hood. I think that that is really important. They need to get, understand what's going on with us. And even if we don't talk about it with them, at least we know they're looking into it and they are learning something. So I think that was really great. And so when you've seen men, in your where you've presented or who have read this book, what have they been most curious about, and what are they most concerned about when it comes to menopause?
So one of the main things is that they just want to understand how to communicate, what they can do to be supportive. And they're scared of saying the wrong thing in a workplace. They're unsure if they should attend information sessions. They're scared to basically say the wrong thing, put their foot in it, offend someone. Sometimes in home, they can feel like everything they say and do is wrong. They can feel, I've spoke to quite a lot of men when I interviewed quite a lot of men for the book as well. And that sometimes can be very challenging for men because they feel like everything they're trying to say and do, that they're not getting it quite right. They've been really shocked, a lot of men, at how young it can start. Like only today, I was speaking to a man exactly that, saying how shocked he was. But he was actually saying that he had then been on some training and tried to talk to his partner about it. And she had kind of given him a bit of pushback because she herself, like, had not realized how young it could start. And so sometimes that's a challenge for them as well, is that even if they get some information, it's how to convey it to us without us having some resistance. And also, they don't always understand the impact of things like gendered ageism and the challenge that is for us as women. And some of those kind of more nuanced conversations that they might just not be aware of. They often don't realize how profoundly it can impact us or why. Or I've had a lot of men say, it's absolutely massive and it's just like, I don't recognize my wife anymore. I don't recognize my partner. I feel like I've lost my partner. But they also sometimes don't realize how little as women we know. And I think that comes back to why I wrote this book in the way I did. And I actually believe that a lot of women would do well to read it as well, is that I feel like as women, the way we learned about menopause, we've learned more from podcasts like yours, from talking in Facebook groups, potentially talking with friends, maybe colleagues, than we normally do going to see a medical practitioner. And men don't really have those networks to engage in, which one is why I set up my Facebook group, but also why I put so much information into that one book, because often the men won't then speak to each other about it, so they can't get that peer learning. But then I think what's also really shocking to men is they don't realize how difficult sometimes it can be for us as women to get treatment, even if we think that there is something that's a concern medically, that we go to a professional. And it's sometimes quite challenging for them to be like, well, you think this is the issue, go speak to the doctor. And then they're really shocked to learn how, quite frankly, gaslit so many women can be, and so much of a struggle it can be to get the appropriate support from medical professionals. I think that's been very shocking for them, but also can be very empowering if they understand now how they can support their partner to get better access to treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the other things that men have been discussed with me that they've found quite concerning or has really affected their relationship, a lot of things to do with changes in libido, changes in their sex life. I had some men who really interested me with such personal conversations about their intimate lives and their relationships, and some men who have been so understanding of their partner's change in libido, for example, that I felt such compassion to the men that we're speaking to about that. Um, and then the other thing that's been really shocking, and to the people when I've talked to them about it, and specifically in a work context as well, is mental load. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, when I'm doing an awareness session in a workplace just for men, I'll explain the concept of mental load. I'll run through some exercises about mental load. And within that safe space, if it's a man-only space as well, I think it's easier for them to grasp the concept and think about it. And sometimes they're really shocked because they kind of hadn't thought it through of how much of a burden some of that mental load and that invisible mental load that us as women carry is, and how that can be why sometimes then adding in the challenges perimenopause can seem like all of a sudden there's a straw that's broke the camel's back, and it kind of gives them a bit more context and understanding of why that can be.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit about mental load? Because I don't know if everybody would understand exactly what that means.
So basically, the theory of mental load is that in addition to the paid work that we all do in our jobs, there is a mental load that's associated with the running of our household and our lives, and that this is largely invisible, and that it is largely a burden borne by women. It's not to say that men don't have a mental load, but their mental load is quite different. Like the mental load that men carry generally in association with the running of household is the burden of being the provider, of keeping the family safe. The burden of mental load that women carry is just this massive, wide bundle of snakes, basically, of everything, of what's going to be for dinner, whether the kids have got enough clothes for school tomorrow, whether they also needed an extra load because it's sports day, whether the dog's vaccinations are up to date, whether the dog's got enough food, has XYZ also been done, blah, 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 blah. This massive long kind of laundry list of things that when everything's ticking along fine, most of it's invisible.
Mm-hmm.
When it gets too much to bear, not only does it people feel like they're dropping balls, but also they can feel like they're not coping with everything, and they can feel quite snappy and overburdened about it. And that's the sort of thing to do with the mental load that, because it's been invisible before, some of it and the extent of it and the width of it, why all of a sudden it's something that men haven't really thought about as much. And this can be the stuff that once we start feeling like we're extra tired, why when we're feeling like our brain's not working quite as well as it should be, etc., it becomes that load is heavier to carry, and we just can't cope basically quite often with it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of women don't realize how much they're carrying until they get to this time of life when things do become more difficult, when maybe they have more anxiety, they're more tired, they're physically just not feeling themselves. And all of a sudden, like you said, they start dropping balls and they wonder what's wrong with them. And yeah, I think it's so valuable to, first of all, for women to understand that what they are carrying and that it is a lot. We are carrying a lot of the day-to-day things, like you said. And then for men to understand it and accept it. Like, do you find that men accept that? Is that because I'm just wondering just how they take that when you mention mental load.
So the way that I feel like is safest for men to be presented with the concept, and the way I try and do it, and the way I encourage organizations to try and do it, is if I was doing work with organizations, is I try and bring it up in a men only session rather than a group session. So they are don't feel criticized when we're discussing the topic, because I'm basically the only woman there, and I make it really clear that I'm recognizing that it's not that men don't help with things and they don't have mental load, it's just that women's load is broader and heavier and more like a wriggling bunch of snakes, like I said. Really, the conversations I've had where we have broached that topic, I feel like they've always been really positive. I don't know if I was to present something like that in a group where it was men and women, where there was some quite antagonistic women in there or some quite defensive men, whether it would go as well. I feel like you have to make the people who you're sharing these concepts with feel safe when we're having these conversations, and that they're not being attacked or criticized. And every time I've had one of those conversations, it's been a really positive conversation, actually. And when I've had one-on-one conversations about things quite often, so for example, I had a conversation with someone as part of one of the interviews for my book, and it's not shared in my book, but we had this fascinating conversation where he was talking about his partner and his share of particular domestic chores, and how once she had gone through perimenopause and had this huge generalized anxiety develop, that they'd had these discussions of how he could support her better, and he's taken more of a share of some of these domestic duties. And he's one of the good guys because he'd recognized some of this stuff, he'd communicated some of this stuff, he's giving this support. But what was absolutely fascinating is when we had the conversation, some of the words he used, and I said to him at the end of it, and I said, you know what's really interesting? You're one of the good guys, and you've just told me this amazing account of how you've been so wonderfully supportive and how you've recognized, you've educated. But look at the words you just said. You said, and when she's struggling more, I help more with the housework. It's not I
Mm,
do more or I
yeah.
share more, it's I help. And that just shows how deeply some of these patterns are ingrained, and they both work full time and they both have equally senior roles. And
Yeah.
it just shows, and he was like, wow, yeah, it's that societal ingraining where he was helping her.
Yes, that it wasn't his responsibility that, yeah,
And
at
and
all.
and
So,
it's when you can have a conversation about that, which is just bringing awareness, not in a critical way,
yeah.
then you can really enact change, because you've made the person feel like they're not being attacked, they're not safe, and they can go, wow, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And these are people who, and we do it ourselves sometimes as women as well, by accident, because we're so conditioned that even our male allies can be just realize they're falling into these little traps of thought that we've just been conditioned by society. And
Mhm.
just awareness is key, basically. So it's been really interesting, some of the conversations I've had with it really made me think about some of societal roles and how we fall into these thought traps as well. And I definitely think that the men I've spoken to possibly because they're already partly down their journey of awareness, have just been so positive about learning and about wanting to have a better conversation about all of these things.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you're shining a light on that, on the thoughts, the language that we use because it is mostly unconscious, not just for men, but for women too. We don't even realize it. Like most of us wouldn't have picked up on what you just mentioned, like he's helping her, right? It's just like, oh, well, that's, that is the way most of us will probably still say it, still see it. And yet it's so not right, especially in this day and age. This isn't our roles have shifted but our language and our society is slow to change. So, but this is such an important part of the conversation are these hidden thoughts, these other layers behind things, because they definitely affect and show up in the menopause transition where all of a sudden we do need to share things with them. We do need to share the load with them. And this is such an important conversation to have, even if it is separately at first. I like that you do speak to the men. I think it can be, we can all be on the defensive when we're mixed, right? Because we do have our points of view and anyways, but I just think that's very, very good to separate, at least at first, to be able to say it in a safe space, like you said.
I feel like
So,
I do advise that quite often to organizations where I'm saying you can bring people together for some conversations, but start with having separate, but also we both do, like you said, need the safe spaces because especially when we talk about some of the more intimate sort of, symptoms or whatever. I mean, I'll talk about, my genitourinary issues and things with no shame whatsoever. That's my role if I go in as an awareness speaker. But if I were a woman wanting to talk about some of that stuff, I might not even feel comfortable talking with my female colleagues. I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable talking with male colleagues about it, and also might not understand some of it. So I definitely think there's a role for having conversations separately as well as together. And hopefully little by little we can remove some of those stigmas and taboos within the workplace and in the home, because some of the conversations some of the topics I've discussed in my book, I think some people wouldn't be comfortable speaking with their partner about anyway. So it's almost easier if it's explained by a separate person.
yeah. Yeah, I think it is. I think these are topics that we're already like are very still we're still not able, although we're having children with these people where they're seen as naked, but these conversations are not happening. We're not talking about the issues that we're having because of stigma, because of whatever. I'm not really even sure, but I guess it's just the way we've been brought up, keeping everything very private. But how do we speak to the men in our lives? So if we do want to share this, and I think probably a really good way is just to buy your book and say, here, I want you to look at this. That could be one way of, opening the door to some conversation. But what are some other ways that we could approach them? Because I think that it could be a very defensive conversation if we start, and we don't want that. We don't want to start that way.
And I think that goes both ways as well. And I say in my book as well to the men, some of the conversations that you might be trying to have, or you might be annoyed because you feel like someone hasn't had a particular conversation with you. It might be that they haven't from a place of fear, but it also might be a place of care. So, for example, if we think of sexual pain, it's like if someone's been with someone for 20 years and all of a sudden nothing feels the same and they're not enjoying sex or it's painful or whatever, sometimes people feel so awkward about how they're going to discuss it that they just avoid it altogether. But also sometimes people try and push through for a bit first and go through thinking, I'll just do it even though it's painful, and don't discuss it because they don't want to hurt or offend their partner. And obviously their partner will be absolutely mortified if they think that they would be, they're causing pain to someone, or that the partner's not enjoying it. And so I do think it goes both ways with the women as well. I think for us as women, we have to realize and remember that the men in our lives are on a learning journey, just the same as we were, and just the same as we might still be, but they're probably behind us on it. So even though as women, a lot of us have received the information we needed too late, the men are receiving it even later still. And we've got to empathize with that and remember that when we were younger, we also didn't realize or understand or listen. And we also didn't think it would happen to us when it did. We also potentially haven't realized till something quite profound happens, how profound it can be. I think a lot of us, if we go back 10, 15 years, would not have realized potentially that a symptom could happen or that it could be so profound. We have to accept if we're not great at communication either. So both parties, and I say this in a workplace environment as well, that the skills of good communication, we do need to learn them, and we also need to reflect on whether we're good at them or not. And I've got to say, there's been quite a few men who I've spoken to at workplace things who've been, their wives are now postmenopausal. And when they've said stuff to me, they've kind of reflected back and said, I really feel like a lot of the skills that I used as a good manager or that I learned in a management course or a communication course really benefited me while I was having these conversations. And I explain the concepts in my book of things like active listening, open questions, holding space. But a lot of women don't really understand what those concepts are as well, or haven't practiced them. And I think it's important for us to not assume that the woman will be the one who understands how to communicate everything and that the man isn't. It could be the other way around. And then something else that I think people often forget is if they start having a conversation about something and they've thought about it for ages. So like if the woman starts talking to the man about something that's been bothering her for ages, we've been thinking about how to say it and what we've been thinking about for potentially days, weeks before that conversation. Not always, because sometimes it just bursts out. But quite often we've been mulling it over for a while. But the person on the other end of the conversation, this might be brand new information to them. And we can't expect them necessarily to handle it amazingly straight away if it's been something that's been bothering us for ages. And we might need to give them time to process, to respond, to not feel defensive, because it might be new information or a new concept to them. And I think we need to support our partners, our friends around us in a non-threatening way to come to that journey of understanding and realization where they don't feel like they're getting told off, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So well, it makes me think of the book Crucial Conversations or Nonviolent. I can't remember the name of the book, but these are things that we've learned in other contexts that could be so helpful in this situation, and things that unfortunately, that we're just applying now. Maybe we could have done this years ago, but we have to realize we have, as women too, a role in this. Like we need to be able to communicate what is happening with us and to understand, like you said, that we might have been thinking about this for quite a while, but they have not. So yeah, they're going to respond the way they are because they're hearing it for the first time. So we have to have some understanding around that and not be defensive or surprised at maybe their reaction to things, which is what makes it difficult to open up in the first place. So yeah, I think there's so much that needs to be worked on for both women and men if we're going to get through this together, I think is key. Yeah.
And the thing is that both partners quite often are scared and confused, and we've got our own defenses. Sometimes the women will feel like they're getting told that they're old, and we've got all of the stuff that comes up for us as women around that. If we're talking about something to do with a sexual relationship, there's all sorts of defenses and stigmas around that sort of conversation. Every relationship has got its own history, and everyone's got their own personality, and all that comes into it. So there's no simple one size fits all. It all comes down to communication and empathy, and whatever that looks like in each individual relationship, I think, whether that be in the workplace, a friendship, or in a romantic partner.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because obviously this isn't just for women who are in a relationship or in a long-term relationship with a man. This is for women who are, single and meeting people too. It's, having these conversations with people you might not know as well. Like you said, if you're having pain while you're having sex, can you have that conversation with somebody maybe you don't know as well? It'll be very different maybe than having a conversation you've been with somebody you've been with for 20 years. Yeah.
I think potentially an easier conversation, actually,
Perhaps,
because
perhaps.
if you know if you're speaking with a new partner, then they don't know what you were like 20 years ago. They don't know what you liked 20 years ago. They might not like, they don't know that something that they all they know is you in that point. So if you are entering a relationship in your 40s and your 50s, it might be a lot easier with a new partner to, for example, always use a lube, or to say,
Mm,
oh, like that, I really enjoy it when you do that, and I'd love it if you did that, as a nice way of saying, well, the other thing doesn't bother me or whatever. Whereas if it's someone who has been with someone for 20 years and now they feel like they need to use lube, it's very difficult to introduce that. Potentially it shouldn't be, but there's all this stuff tied up with that, of people having the idea that you should always be wet, and that if you're not
mm,
wet, they've done something wrong, or that you're not into it, or you've failed, or they've failed. And also, in terms of our actual sensation of what our genitalia feels, having changed while our hormones are changing, it might be that someone's been with someone for 20 years and they used to really, really enjoy a particular sexual act or a way of doing things, that now it just leaves them cold. And it's a hard conversation to have. And that that can be a harder conversation to have than with a new partner where you're just like, no, I don't enjoy that.
yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Yeah, because we're very worried about offending if we've changed our minds. Well, we haven't really changed our minds, but just changed sensations about something, and to be able to communicate that without feeling like we're going to be letting our partners down. That is, yeah, it's a
And then,
big
I mean,
part of
like,
that.
I mentioned like the orgasm gap in my book, and I put some data in about the orgasm gap. And that can be quite challenging for men, because they might be like, right, so does that mean that every single time I've ever had sex with my partner of 20 years, she actually wasn't enjoying it with as much as I thought she was? That it goes into people's ideas of their own masculinity and the communication that's always been between partners, etc. And it's I kind of say, right, here's some data. And you might not think this applies to you, but given it applies to a huge percentage of men, it may well apply to you. You just might not have realized it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, so it's something to come to terms with too, I guess.
But I mean, the thing is that hopefully, by all that better communication, and I'm not a sex therapist, but I'd like to think that if I encourage people to understand more about their bodies, have less shame and stigma about talking about these things, and understand how to give and receive pleasure better, that some people for this book will make them have better sex lives in midlife because they can communicate better. And, and also for those women who are distressed if they've lost their libido and do want to get it back, that this is one resource that can explain to them why that might be that they've lost it and what might help
Mm.
them get it back. Because there is a large proportion of women who have had libido changes and are really unhappy about the fact that they've had the libido changes, just as their partner is.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And yet there are things they can do about it. But again, it's something that women have to talk about, not in this case, not just with their partners, but with a medical professional or somebody else. But yeah, it's so key.
And
But
the
yeah,
thing is as
there
well,
go ahead.
that Knowing what to say to the medical professional can make, you know this as well as I, that it can be game changing, because a lot of times a woman will talk to a professional and they, unfortunately, with perimenopause symptoms and menopause treatments, the professional won't be going, oh, have you thought about vaginal estrogen? Oh, what about vaginal moisturizer? Oh, let me suggest this as a treatment, etc. It's often it's from the patient understanding, from talking, from reading, etc., that then she can say, can I try this? And understand how transformative some of these interventions can be.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really key point is that we do have to self-educate before we go into the doctor's office most of the time because the doctors aren't even educated on a lot of this. And we have to know what we're asking for and why. And I think that is something that's so key. We're so used to going into a doctor's office and expecting them to know and tell us what the problem is and what the solution is. Here we've got to do it on our own and try to do that and then go see them and run it and be able to say it again, talk to somebody about what's going on with us and be able to actually talk about it. Yeah, it's really tricky. I can see how a lot of women probably do not get help for sexual dysfunction, sexual issues during this time.
And likewise with things like energy issues and, the issues with, for example, testosterone. Without us educating ourselves and our peers educating us, then if someone was just really struggling and their practitioner that they went to was of the opinion that that's completely irrelevant, it would never be brought up. There'd never be understanding that that might be a possibility.
No, no, that's right. Yeah, it's fascinating and this is a time to get educated and a time to understand your body. If you've never done it before, I think this is the time we need to look under our own hoods and to be able to understand what's going on with ourselves because only then can we then communicate with our partners about it or we can't expect them to know more than we do. That's just not the way it goes.
And the
Yeah.
benefit as well, of course, is that, it's not just about HRT, it's about everything to do with our lifestyle that can support us being really healthy. And most of the interventions that are to do with nutrition, movement, exercise, sleep, self-care, that's not just going to benefit menopause, it's going to benefit our all-round health. And if those interventions are enacted for our whole family, then it benefits not just us as women's health, it benefits our partner's health, it benefits our children's health. If we move more, if we're healthier, if we're happier, if we're less obese, if we've got better heart health, everyone in the family is benefiting. So a lot of the interventions that we can empower ourselves through knowledge to make and to support our partners to make can actually benefit us in so many other ways as well as just menopause, that's just like, it's just the gift that keeps on giving mentally and physically in a really positive way if we know how to do it and if we can support each other to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that is key too, is that it isn't just about going into the doctor's office, but there's a lot of things we do have control over that can make a big difference to how we're feeling. And it can positively impact the people around us. Again, it's a conversation though that needs to happen because I know working with women as a coach, they face a lot of resistance when they try to change things and they have to explain, they might have to say things that talk about things that they didn't want to talk about, but it's important that they do because yeah, these are game changing things you can do for yourself in your own lifestyle by changing the way you eat, changing the way you move, reducing your stress, getting better sleep, all of these things that you can actually do. And yes, it might impact the relationship as well with your husband, but it's to have those conversations again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, this has been a really enlightening conversation. I think this is so important for my audience, so important for all women and men to understand that there's, we both need to know what's going on in menopause. It's not a one sex conversation, it involves everybody. And I just love that you've put that out there in a book, which is a great way to consume it. You can, have this book and you can refer to it when you want to if you have questions, men or women. I just think it's so valuable. So before we wrap up, though, I always ask my guests a question, and the question is, what's the best part of getting older for you, Niki?
I think it's the freedom of the confines and the that I used to feel when I was younger. The worry of what people might think. I'm not saying I never worry about what people think now, but I think I worry a lot less. And I also think I've got more of a knowledge and empowerment now of knowing that I could take action to improve my present and my future, that I didn't have that confidence and that empowerment when I was younger either. So to be honest, and it sounds like such a cliche, but I feel better now. I'm more positive now. I'm more self-assured now than I did when I was younger. And it's almost like that gift you wish you could give your younger self.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love that because it's true. We think, why didn't we have this when we were younger? But we had to live our lives. We had to have experiences in order to get here. It's not something you can just plant in somebody's brain. It's something you actually have to live, and that's what we've done up until this point, and that's why you're able to feel the empowerment you feel, which is wonderful. I love that answer. So, if any women in my audience want to get in touch with you or would they want to buy your book, how can they do these things?
So I am on LinkedIn. I'm Niki Woods. I am on Facebook, Niki Woods. I'm on Instagram, Niki Woods Best Midlife. Can't even say it. Niki Woods Best Midlife. My book is The Man's Guide to Menopause, and that is available on Amazon, and you can get it in paperback or in Kindle version. And I think that's probably covered it all. I
All
think I've got a
right.
website, nikiwoods.com. Men, please come join my Facebook group, also called The Men's
Yes.
Guide to Menopause. You're very, very welcome.
Yes, and we'll include the links to everything, including the men's Facebook group in the show notes so that everybody can find all of these resources that Nikki has. So thank you so much, Nikki, for sharing your book, for sharing your expertise, for talking about this, because I think it's such a needed topic that we're not talking about the impact of menopause on men and the conversations that need to take place. So thank you for bringing that here today.
Thank you so much for this discussion.
Thank you. All right.